Officer Reynolds smirks as he arrests another suspicious person in his neighborhood, a well-dressed black woman taking pictures of houses. At the station, she calmly asks for one phone call. Minutes later, his chief bursts through the door, his confident demeanor suddenly shattered as he frantically apologizes to her. What happens in the next few minutes will change both their lives forever. The morning sun glinting off perfectly washed windows of million-dollar homes. The neighborhood's manicured lawns and expensive cars represented everything he'd sworn to protect. 20 years on the force had taught him what belonged here and what didn't. The dashboard computer blinked with the day's reports. A noise complaint from the night before, a suspicious vehicle report that turned out to be a food delivery driver, and a missing cat poster someone had called in as suspicious paper activity. Reynolds ignored them all. He knew what real threats looked like. His methods weren't popular with the younger officers, especially the new recruit, Martinez, who'd questioned his random stops last week, but Reynolds didn't care. He'd grown up watching his father patrol these same streets, learning that safety meant keeping certain people out. The world was changing, but Reynolds wasn't about to change with it. Last month's department meeting about community policing still rankled him. The new policies felt soft, weak. In Reynolds' mind, effective policing meant maintaining clear boundaries. The statistics might show declining crime rates under the new approach, but he trusted his gut more than any spreadsheet. That spring morning painted a perfect picture of suburban tranquility. Reynolds watched joggers wave as he passed, gardeners tending to their flower beds and residents walking their dogs. A group of kids played basketball in one of the driveways, their laughter carrying across the perfectly trimmed hedges. Everything was in its place, until it wasn't. A woman caught his attention. She stood on the sidewalk, phone raised to photograph one of the colonial-style homes. Her casual clothes stood out among Maple Ridge's usual well-dressed residents. But it wasn't her clothes that made Reynolds slow his patrol car. It was her skin color. Reynolds watched as she moved methodically down the street, stopping at each house, taking pictures, and making notes on her phone. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as old prejudices surfaced. In his mind, the equation was simple. Black woman plus expensive neighborhood plus photographing houses equals suspicious activity. He'd seen this before, or at least he thought he had. His instincts had led to dozens of stops over the years. Last summer he'd stopped 3 suspicious individuals in 1 week. The neighborhood association had sent him a thank you note. Some complained, some threatened lawsuits, but nothing ever came of it. The system worked in his favor and he knew it. Reynolds radioed dispatch, reporting his location and intention to investigate suspicious activity. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, asking if he needed backup. He declined. He'd handled plenty of these situations alone. Besides, the younger officers might hesitate, might ask too many questions. He pulled his patrol car to the curb and stepped out, adjusting his belt with practiced authority. The leather creaked as he moved, his hand instinctively resting near his weapon, not touching it, just close enough to feel its presence. He approached the woman, who was now studying a Tudor-style house with particular interest. She didn't seem startled by his presence. In fact, she barely acknowledged him at all. The officer cleared his throat, adopting the tone he'd perfected over years of these routine checks. He informed her about supposed reports of suspicious activity in the area. It was a lie he'd used countless times before, one that gave him the excuse he needed to interrogate anyone he deemed out of place. The woman's response wasn't what he expected. No nervousness, no defensiveness, just calm assertion that she was taking a walk and enjoying the architecture. Her composure irritated him. In his experience, guilt came with fear, and her lack of fear felt like a challenge. Reynolds noticed her studying the house's security cameras with particular interest. In his mind, this confirmed his suspicions. He pressed harder, demanding identification. When she refused, citing her constitutional rights, something inside him snapped. Her composure felt like defiance, her knowledge of her rights like disrespect. Without warning, he grabbed her wrists and slapped on his handcuffs. The metal clicked into place with familiar efficiency. A couple walking their dog across the street hurried past, averting their eyes. Reynolds had seen that reaction before. People preferred to look away, to pretend everything was normal. The woman winced at the tight metal but remained surprisingly composed. Reynolds ignored her complaints about excessive force, making a dismissive comment about cooperation making everything easier. He noticed neighbors peeking through their curtains, but he knew they'd never interfere. They trusted him to keep their neighborhood safe. As he led her to his patrol car, she maintained her dignity, walking straight back despite the handcuffs. Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this arrest. Most people begged, argued, or threatened. She did none of these things. Instead, she watched him with an unsettling scrutiny, as if she was the one evaluating him. At the station, Reynolds walked her past the front desk where Officer Miller raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Everyone knew Reynolds' methods, and no one questioned them anymore. The newest recruits learned quickly to look the other way when he brought in his suspicious persons. In the holding area, the woman requested her phone call with the same irritating calmness she'd shown during the arrest. Reynolds barely paid attention as she made the call, already starting the paperwork. Another suspicious person report to add to his collection. He'd perfected the language over the years. Subject exhibited suspicious behavior, refused to comply with officer commands, showed signs of potential criminal intent. The phone call itself seemed brief and unremarkable. The woman spoke in low tones, mentioning only an address and a name. Reynolds caught fragments about Maple Ridge and exactly as suspected, but didn't think much of it. He'd heard plenty of people make their one phone call over the years, to lawyers, family members, employers. None had ever amounted to anything. What happened next would shake the foundations of everything Reynolds believed in. His chief burst through the door, face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. In 15 years, Reynolds had seen the chief face down armed suspects, handle political scandals, and manage riot situations, all without losing his cool. But now, something had rattled him to his core. The chief's transformation was immediate and shocking. Gone was the authoritative leader Reynolds knew, the man who had backed his old-school methods time and time again. Instead, he watched in disbelief as his superior frantically apologized to the woman, fumbling with the handcuff keys. His hands shook as he worked the lock, something Reynolds had never seen before. But it wasn't until the chief addressed her as Your Honor that Reynolds felt the first real surge of fear. The title hung in the air like a thunderclap, changing everything in an instant. The woman he'd arrested wasn't just any citizen exercising her rights. She was federal judge Angela Wilson, and Reynolds' world was about to collapse around him. The chief's initial shock quickly turned to fury. In his office, with the door barely closed, he exploded. Years of overlooked complaints, ignored warnings, and systematic bias could no longer be swept under the rug. Reynolds sat in stunned silence as his superior detailed the consequences. Potential lawsuits, department investigations, media scrutiny. Everything he'd built over 20 years could crumble because of one routine stop. But as Reynolds sat there absorbing the gravity of his situation, Judge Wilson wasn't done delivering life-altering news. She entered the chief's office without knocking, her presence commanding instant attention. The truth she revealed next would shake Reynolds to his core. She wasn't randomly photographing houses in Maple Ridge, she was conducting an official investigation. Each house she photographed matched specific details from a case she was reviewing. A case that Reynolds knew all too well, though he'd tried to forget it for the past decade. 10 years ago, David Reynolds had been convicted of armed robbery. Despite his protests of innocence, despite the family's desperate appeals, he'd been sentenced to 20 years. Reynolds had distanced himself from the case, convinced of his brother's guilt. The evidence had seemed overwhelming at the time. Security camera footage, witness statements, everything pointing to his guilt. Judge Wilson pulled out her phone, showing Reynolds the photos she'd taken that morning. Each house represented a piece of the puzzle she was assembling. The Tudor-style home where she'd been arrested, its security cameras covered the same intersection where the robbery allegedly took place. The colonial house down the street, its position relative to the streetlights cast doubt on witness statements about visibility that night. Reynolds listened in growing horror as the judge methodically dismantled the case against his brother. The security footage that had seemed so damning. The camera angles didn't match the witness testimony about where the perpetrator had come from. The timestamps on the footage showed suspicious gaps that hadn't been investigated in the original trial. The witnesses who'd identified David, Judge Wilson had discovered that 3 of them had been shown his photo before the lineup, a clear violation of procedure. Another witness had changed their story after multiple interviews with the original investigating officer, yet these earlier contradictory statements had never been presented at trial. As the judge spoke, Reynolds remembered his brother's desperate pleas of innocence. He'd dismissed them, believing in the system, believing in the evidence. Now, sitting in the chief's office, he realized how his own prejudices might have contributed to his brother's conviction. The same biases that led him to arrest Judge Wilson that morning had made it easy for him to accept his brother's guilt without question. Reynolds now faced the harsh reality that his actions had far-reaching consequences. Judge Wilson presented new evidence that could potentially exonerate his brother. For the first time in years, Reynolds felt a glimmer of hope. Determined to make amends, he vowed to fight for justice, not just for his brother, but for all those wronged by the system. The following weeks passed in a blur of revelations and investigations. Judge Wilson's team uncovered more inconsistencies in David's case. A forensic expert re-examined the security footage, finding signs of tampering with the timestamp data. A new witness came forward, having stayed silent for years out of fear of the real perpetrator. Reynolds threw himself into the investigation, driven by guilt and a desperate need for redemption. He reviewed old case files, interviewed former colleagues, and confronted uncomfortable truths about how his department had handled similar cases over the years. Each discovery felt like another crack in the foundation of everything he'd believed about justice. The investigation revealed a pattern of rushed conclusions and overlooked evidence that went beyond David's case. Judge Wilson discovered that several other convictions from the same period showed similar problems. Witnesses pressured to change statements, evidence processed without proper documentation, and defendants who couldn't afford proper legal representation. 3 weeks after that fateful morning in Maple Ridge, David Reynolds walked out of prison a free man. The evidence Judge Wilson uncovered didn't just suggest reasonable doubt, it proved his complete innocence. 10 years of his life had been taken because of hasty assumptions, prejudiced investigations, and a system that favored quick convictions over thorough justice. The reunion between the brothers was bittersweet. David had aged in prison, his once bright eyes now carrying a permanent wariness. When he hugged his brother, Reynolds felt the tremors in David's body, a decade of suppressed fear and anger finally finding release. The words "I told you" hung unspoken between them. But Judge Wilson wasn't finished. She saw in this incident an opportunity for real change. The prejudices that had led to both David's conviction and Reynolds' actions that morning weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper problem that plagued the entire justice system. She implemented mandatory anti-bias training programs in the department, using their case as a powerful example. Officers were forced to confront their own prejudices through real scenarios and case studies. Some resisted, but others began to recognize patterns in their own behavior that needed to change. Judge Wilson's determination to reform the system was unwavering, and her efforts began to show results. As David and Reynolds walked together, they knew their journey was far from over, but they faced it with renewed hope. The local media picked up the story. At first they focused on the scandal, a racist officer arresting a federal judge. But as more details emerged, the narrative shifted. It became a story about systemic bias, about how prejudice could blind even those sworn to protect justice, and about the possibility of redemption. Reynolds couldn't continue wearing the badge after everything that happened. The weight of his actions, not just that morning, but throughout his career, pressed too heavily on his conscience. Every traffic stop he'd made, every suspicious person he'd questioned, every arrest that had seemed justified at the time, all of it now haunted him with new context. But in his resignation, he found a new purpose. Working alongside his newly freed brother, he helped establish an organization dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted individuals navigate the justice system. They named it Second Look Justice, reflecting their belief that many cases deserved fresh eyes and unbiased review. Their organization started small, operating out of a converted storage room in David's lawyer's office. But word spread quickly. Families of convicted individuals reached out, sharing stories of questionable evidence, rushed trials, and possible prejudice. Reynolds found himself using his law enforcement experience in a new way, identifying procedural mistakes, questioning official narratives, and advocating for thorough reinvestigations. David's experience in prison proved invaluable to their work. He understood firsthand the despair of being wrongly convicted, the frustration of not being believed, and the complexity of the prison system. His insights helped them develop programs to support not just the wrongfully convicted, but also their families who often struggled with financial and emotional burdens. Their first major success came 6 months after David's release. They helped overturn the conviction of Marcus Thompson, a young man who'd spent 5 years in prison for a robbery he didn't commit. Like David's case, the original investigation had been rushed, relying heavily on circumstantial evidence and biased witness testimonies. The brothers' story became a powerful testament to change. Local law enforcement departments began inviting them to speak at training sessions. They shared their perspectives, One brother who'd enforced the law with prejudice, the other who'd suffered from that prejudice. Their personal experience brought a reality to these sessions that textbook training couldn't match. Judge Wilson kept in touch, often consulting with their organization on cases she reviewed. She saw in their work a necessary counterbalance to a system that sometimes valued efficiency over accuracy. Her words to Reynolds before leaving became the motto of their organization: "Sometimes we need to face our worst selves to become our best selves." That spring morning, a single phone call hadn't just exposed Reynolds' prejudices, it had set in motion a chain of events that would change countless lives. The call that had made his chief pale wasn't just about arresting a federal judge, it was about confronting a system of bias that had destroyed lives, including his own brother's. 5 years after that morning in Maple Ridge, Second Look Justice had helped free 15 wrongfully convicted individuals. Each case represented years of lost life, broken families, and shattered dreams, but each successful appeal also represented hope, proof that change was possible, that wrongs could be righted, that justice could prevail even after years of injustice. Today, the Reynolds brothers continue their work, turning moments of injustice into opportunities for redemption. Their story serves as a reminder that change is possible, even in the face of deeply ingrained beliefs and systemic prejudices. The organization they built has become a beacon of hope for families fighting against wrongful convictions, and a powerful force for reform in the criminal justice system. As they look to the future, the Reynolds brothers remain committed to their mission, knowing that every case they take on is a step towards a more just world.